Now, this may seem like kind of a strange question for a landlord to ask, but can a landlord refuse to accept money from their tenant during the eviction process? Well, I'm Mark Cunningham at Grace Property Management, and there's been a change in the Colorado legislature with a new bill that has come out. This is under SB 21173. That's Senate Bill 21173. The title of the bill is concerning rights related to residential rental agreements. This is not meant to be a full diagnosis of this bill. It is many, many pages with many, many parts, and we're going to be covering and breaking this down into part by part. Previously, we talked about late fees, but now it's an important aspect of this. Now, previously, before this bill was in place, here's how the legal eviction process worked. A tenant didn't pay rent. Landlord has to prepare and legally serve a demand notice physically upon the tenant. That demand notice would give the tenants, as it is now, another 10 days to pay. And during that 10 days, if the tenant comes in with payment, the landlord must accept it. But after the 10-day period, if the landlord decided, if the tenant hadn't paid, and the landlord wants to initiate the eviction process, they would typically involve an attorney at that point, and a court date is set. And let's say that it's the day of court, and by this time it's been several weeks. And let's say the tenant comes in on that day of court and says, hey, I want to pay. The landlord could legally say, no, you know what? We've gone this far. I need you to move. I'm refusing to accept your payment. That's how it previously was. However, now going forward, that is no longer the rule. No longer the rule. The new rule is this. Landlords must accept full payment at any time until a judge issues a judgment for possession. At any time. That's a long time, because evictions in Colorado realistically, typically right now, are taking about 90 days. That's 3 months. So that means you could go through start the eviction process, go all the way up to the end, and this is a long, drawn-out process. And the judge is about to slap his gavel down and rule in favor of the landlord and grant possession of the property back to the landlord, and the tenant can say, wait. You know what? Actually, hey, you know what? I want to pay. And the landlord must accept that payment, and the whole thing is canceled. Now, you can imagine, often that may sound good for the landlord, but typically if it gets to that point in time, the landlord may be so frustrated and fed up that they just want their property back. They want possession back. Now, there's a couple important aspects of this bill I want to point out. Number one, landlords may decline partial payment. It says you have to take full payment, but you can decline partial payment. So if you're evicting your tenant and they owe you $5,000 in back rent, and they come in with that $5,000, must you take it? Yes, you must. But if they only come in with $3,000 and say, hey, here's $3,000 of my $5,000 balance, the landlord could, if they wanted to, say, no, I will only take full payment. I'm not going to take partial. It's an important aspect, number one. Important aspect, others, is this. The tenant may make this payment to the landlord or to the court, the bill says. So if the tenant doesn't want to deal with the landlord because they're just a pain in the neck or they don't trust the landlord, the tenant could make that payment in full to the court. The court would then pass it on to the landlord. But that's written into this bill specifically, that the tenant can pay the court directly. Part number 4 is this. For the landlord, this is important for landlords to know. Accepting a partial payment or any payment, if you accept any payments, that terminates the legal eviction process at the moment you accept those funds. So here's why that's important to know. Let's pretend that you as a landlord have a tenant. Tenant didn't pay. You served him with the notice. You waited the 10 days. The attorneys give them another notice. They've got to wait another 7 or 10 days from there. You finally get your day in courts, and everything's moving along, and it's been 90 days, and the tenant comes into your office and is like, you know what, hey, I want to make a partial payment. Here's $10. Would you take $10? And you're like, you know what, you owe me $5,000, so fine, I'll take your $10. Guess what you just did by taking that $10? You legally terminated the entire eviction process, and you got to start over if you want to start again. Because by you accepting anything, $1 even, the process is legally terminated. This is another unintended consequence of this well-meaning bill. Because in the past, landlords could take a partial payment and they wouldn't have to wait too long to reinitiate. It would still kill the eviction process, but because the eviction process could be begun quickly, relatively quickly, they'd say, okay, I'll take your partial, but if you don't pay me the balance in a week, I'm going to start it again. Well, now the landlord is left with saying, well, gosh, if I take this, I can't start this thing again for 10 to 30 days. So I don't want to take a partial because I lose a month. I lose a month. So it's unfortunate. I think this is going to have the unintended consequence of having landlords refuse to take partials, when in the past landlords would be very workable, typically speaking, to accept partial payments and set up payment plans that landlords just aren't going to want to do now because the risk is too great of a tenant not performing. This is effective October 1st of 2021. So if you as a landlord have policies in place that are contrary to this, you better get this in line as of October 1st, 2021 to make sure you're not out of line with how you're accepting these partial payments from tenants. Now, if you're a client of Grace Property Management, rest at ease. We've got all this controlled for you. We're taking care of this to making sure that we're in full compliance and our lease agreements are in full compliance. We want to be fair to you as our landlords, certainly fair to our tenants as well. If we can be a resource to you, reach out to us at Grace Property Management. Our website is rentgrace.com. We are happy to be a resource and help in any way we can.